Good evening. I am Xavier Salomon. I am the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. And welcome to this evening's episode of Travels with a Curator. Last week, we traveled in Van Eyck's footsteps in Bruges, in Flanders. Today, instead, we travel in the footsteps of another Flemish artist from the 17th century this time, Anthony van Dyck, and we go to Genoa. Genoa is along the coast in northern West Italy, and it is one of my favorite cities in Italy. When you first arrive in Genoa, either by ship or by boat, the first thing you see is the lighthouse of the city. And here it is welcoming the visitor to the city. This is the famous Lanterna, one of the tallest lighthouses in the world, and one that dates all the way back to the Middle Ages. And it is still a functioning lighthouse. From the lighthouse, you can look down onto the city. And of course, what you see in the foreground is a sort of rather industrial area, because we cannot forget that Genoa based its wealth and power mostly on its maritime activities, its harbor activities. So still to this day, the harbor of Genoa is one of the most important harbors in Italy. What you see behind, along the curve of the harbor, is the city rising from the sea up to the mountains. And it is a very steep city. I love the way it climbs up from the sea into the hills above it. And it is a city that goes back to antiquity, but that really based its important origins, let's say, in the Middle Ages. And a lot of the city still has this medieval flavor. What you see here are the typically narrow streets of Genoa with very, very tall buildings for that time, back in medieval origins. And these are known in Genoa as carruggi. And many medieval buildings still survive in the city. This is the great Cathedral of St. Lawrence and the Palace of St. George, which has been refashioned a number of times later in the centuries. But in the Middle Ages, this was partly also a prison. And this is where Marco Polo wrote his travels. But during the Renaissance as well, a number of buildings were added in Genoa, like the impressive Basilica of Carignano, which is over one of the hills in the city overlooking Genoa. But we focus now on the 17th century. And in the very early 17th century, in the early 1600s, Peter Paul Rubens, the greatest Flemish artist of the time, travels to Italy and spends some time in Genoa. He ends up producing two altarpieces for the Jesuit Church of Genoa, which you see in this slide. And you see the circumcision on the high altar, and there was a second altarpiece done by Rubens for the altar to the left of the slide. And while in Genoa, he also portrayed the great aristocracy of the city. In the 17th century, Genoa was, like Bruges in the 15th century, one of the richest cities in the world. Banking power, financial power, mercantile power were all parts of what would make Genoa so important. So this was a city where the aristocracy was amongst the wealthiest in the world. And Rubens depicts many people from that group of society in the early 1600s. On the left is the spectacular portrait on horseback of Giocarlo Doria, which is now at the Galleria Nazionale of Palazzo Spinola in Genoa. And on the right, a female portrait of a Genoese noblewoman, which is now at Kingston Lacy in England. But while in Genoa, and Rubens is also hugely impressed with the great palaces that these aristocrats are building. This is a view of what was then called the Strada Nuova, the New Road, which was a road that cut across the city and along which the most prominent families built the most impressive palaces of the day. When we look at them today, they don't seem particularly impressive, but we're used to a world of skyscrapers and large buildings. But you have to think that in the early 1600s, these were amongst the largest palaces owned by single families anywhere in Europe. And Rubens is so impressed by this that he proceeds to do drawings after many of these palaces. And in 1622, he publishes a book, The Palaces of Genoa, where he illustrates the facades and plans of most of these buildings along Strada Nuova. And this gives you a sense of how grandiose these buildings were. Among these buildings, some are today museums and can be visited. This is the Palazzo Bianco, the White Palace. Across the street is the Palazzo Rosso, the Red Palace, and next to the Palazzo Bianco, the Palazzo Tursi. These are all part of a network of museums today known as the Musei di Strada Nuova, the Museums of Strada Nuova, which belong to the city of Genoa and are among the most important museums in the city. They all are under one hat, they're all run together, and they have great treasures in them, from Caravaggio to Canova, paintings by Lippi and Gerard David and Memling, and of course, Van Dyck and Rubens. These museums were given to the city by one of the Genoese aristocrats, a key figure for the history of Genoa in the 19th century, Maria Brignole Sale de Ferrari, the Duchess of Galliera. And the Duchess of Galliera decides to leave all of her collections and the palaces, and she owned both Palazzo Rosso and Palazzo Bianco at that point, to the city of Genoa in the late 19th century. And so she is one of the great heroes of the city. She also funded hospitals and a number of institutions, public institutions in the city. Her name is also connected, amazingly enough, to the Fashion Museum in Paris. If you've ever visited the Fashion Museum there, it's known as the Palais Galliera. And Galliera, of course, is Galliera in Italian. And this was a building that was actually originally built by the Duchess of Galliera with the idea of donating her collections to the city of Paris. And so she designed this museum. The Duke and Duchess of Galliera spent a lot of their lives in Paris. And eventually, for a number of reasons, she decided instead to leave everything in Genoa. And so fortunately, the great Genoese collections of the family are still in the city in Italy. And the Galliera Palace now in Paris is used as the main fashion museum of Paris. But we focus today on Van Dyck. And Anton van Dyck, Anthony van Dyck, as he was known in English, was one of the best pupils of Rubens. And so having known about Genoa from his master, from Rubens himself, he travels to Italy as a young man in the 1620s. And he's basically based in Genoa from 1621 until 1627, with some short interruptions traveling around Italy, and a year he spends in Sicily. These are two self-portraits, the one on the left at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, the one at the right in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, both showing Van Dyck exactly in the 1620s as he first arrives in Genoa. And these are almost identical self-portraits painted around the same time. But you see him, as he is described by many people when he arrives in the city, as an elegant man about town. And Van Dyck arrives and immediately starts painting portraits of the great aristocrats, following in the footsteps of Rubens. Here is Agustino Pallavicini, a wonderful portrait now at the Getty Museum in LA. And here are two more of Genoese noble women. And again, you see the wealth of these outfits and the richness of these sitters, these now both at the National Gallery in Washington. This is probably the grandest portrait Van Dyck paints while in Genoa, and is a portrait of the Lomelimi family, the family of the Doge of Genoa. Genoa was a republic, but it was run by a head of state, an elective head of state, who was the Doge. And so this is the family of the Doge, his children, his sons from the first marriage, his second wife, and the children from the second wife. And this is now in the Scottish National Gallery in Edinburgh. Frick owned 3 Genoese portraits by Van Dyck. Frick was very keen on Van Dyck. He owned overall 8 portraits by the artist, and 3 date to the 1620s, to this period in Genova. This is the first he acquired in 1905, and it is a portrait of a doctor, a young doctor. You see this elegant man against a red curtain. This was originally a rectangular portrait, which was subsequently cut into an oval format. But there are some clues in the portrait that tell us who he is. So he's resting his elbow on a book, or on 2 books, one by Hippocrates, the great doctor of sort of ancient Greece, and the other one by the philosopher Aristotle. And underneath it, there is a Latin inscription which says sine his, without these, as if to suggest that life without Aristotle and Hippocrates would be a lesser life, and a letter on which you can see the name and surname of the sitter. Originally, when Frick acquired this portrait, he was believed to be Demetrio Cannevaro, who was one of the great doctors in Genoa in the 17th century. But as it has been noted later on, Demetrio Cannevaro was actually in his 60s when this portrait was painted in the 1620s. And so it's been suggested that he may be Demetrio's younger brother, Ottaviano Cannevaro. More recently, it's also been suggested that there was another doctor in Genova, confusingly enough, called Ottavio Cannevaro, who had nothing to do with Demetrio and Ottaviano. And so the sitter may be that individual. We still need to do more archival research on this portrait, and it is unclear, really, if this is Ottavio or Ottaviano. But amazingly enough, there were two doctors with the same surname in Genoa at the time when Van Dyck was there. Only a few years later, in 1907, 2 years after acquiring the Cannevaro portrait, Frick buys this female portrait. He believes the sitter to be Giovanna Cattaneo from an important family in Genoa. Cattaneo was said at the time was also referred to in the portrait, the surname, by the fact that the woman is holding this chain, this gold chain. And in Italian, the word chain is catena. Of course, the surname Cattaneo is somewhat reminiscent of catena. But we know again that that is not the case. And this sitter, again, remains an anonymous sitter. Both the Cannevaro portrait and the portrait of the so-called Giovanna Cattaneo come from the Cattaneo della Volta collection in Genoa. Both of them were acquired by Frick through Nödler, the dealer, and before that they were probably in the Lomelimi family. So they went through several aristocratic Genoese families. The grandest portrait Frick had from the Genoese period of Van Dyck's work is this full-length, life-size portrait of a Genoese noble woman. And we don't know who she is, again. When Frick acquired the portrait, and again, you see the wealth of her outfit, the pearls in her hairdress, the gold in the outfit, the ruff. But when Frick bought it, it was believed to be Paolina Brignole Sale. And Paolina Brignole Sale was the wife of Anton Giulio Brignole Sale. They were ancestors, in fact, of the Duchess of Galliera, and they lived at Palazzo Rosso on the Strada Nuova in Genova. The portraits that you see here, the one on the left of the Frick and the one on the right at Palazzo Rosso, are very similar. And the one on the right, we know for sure, is the portrait of Paolina Brignole Sale. But when you look at these closely, you realize that even though the pose and the setting is very similar, they're two different sitters. When Frick acquired the portrait in 1914, one of the newspapers announcing the acquisition of Frick's portrait by mistake actually illustrated the portrait in Genoa. And this gives you a sense of the confusion that remained between these two portraits and the identity of these two portraits. But Paolina Brignole Sale is indeed the woman in the Genoa portrait. Here is a husband on horseback, Anton Giulio, the two of them shown together as pendants. So it remains to be identified who the woman in the Frick portrait is. Piero Boccardo, who's a colleague in Genoa and a good friend, he was for many years the director of the museums of Strada Nuova. He's one of the great experts on Van Dyck in Genoa. He suggested very cleverly that the woman in the Frick portrait may be a widow. And if you look at this detail, you can see that she has a black band across her dress and her cuffs laced in black. So this may be a woman, a young woman who remained a widow very early in her life and is now coming out of widowhood, probably looking for a second husband. Her name, however, still remains shrouded in mystery. So these three Van Dyck portraits bring Genoa into the Frick collection in a number of ways. We have two female portraits, a male portrait, we have a doctor, we have two aristocratic women. Even though all three of them are somewhat mysterious, we don't unfortunately know yet the specific identity of any of these sitters. They really show this extraordinary period in Van Dyck's life, and having other portraits by Van Dyck at the Frick from his early period in Antwerp and from his later period in England, it gives a very full sense of Van Dyck as an artist at the Frick collection. Van Dyck left Genoa in 1627, never to return. He moved back to Antwerp and then eventually to England. But Genoa still remains, in many ways, the city of Van Dyck, a city of narrow streets, of medieval streets, and of these grand 17th century palaces. Whenever I walk through these streets in Genoa, I always think of the words of the most important figure in the cultural world coming out of Genoa in the last 100 years. This is the songwriter Fabrizio Dendre, who was born and lived in Genoa. And he is one of the greatest songwriters of the 20th century in Italy, and also one of Italy's greatest poets of that period. His songs, the words in his songs are particularly beautiful, and many of them are devoted to the city of Genoa. Writing about the Caruggi, these long, narrow, dark streets, he writes in Italian, he says, nei quartieri dove il sole del buon Dio non dà i suoi raggi. In the neighborhood where the sun of the good God does not give his rays. So the idea that these are poor areas of a city, which has changed very much from the 17th century. In the 19th century, in the 20th century, Genoa became a much poorer city. It's not the great center of the financial world. And in fact, it becomes, especially the center, a very impoverished harbor city place. And so Dendre is the singer of this much later Genoa, this city that struggles in a way that Van Dyck wouldn't have recognized. And of course, to finish, we started with the lighthouse, with the Lanterna di Genoa. And I started by saying that everyone coming to Genoa, still to this day, by plane, by boat, first sees the Lanterna. But we cannot forget that the Lanterna was also the last thing that many people saw. And in the 19th century, Genoa was the main harbor from which Italian people would leave Italy for good to seek a better future abroad. And so while the Lanterna was the last thing they saw, the first thing they would see arriving in America would be, hopefully, on many occasions, the Statue of Liberty in New York. So the history of immigration into the United States from Italy, but from many other countries, is also linked to the history of Genoa. So with this episode, I'd like to think a little bit about also foreigners abroad. And so the same way that Van Dyck, as a Flemish man, was welcome in Genoa and worked in Genoa, the same way many Italian families and individuals in the 19th century established their future in America, and many of their descendants are still in New York and in the United States. So these lighthouses are very much symbols of hope and change, and I think still very much of how many people living in New York and moving to New York would have thought of the Lanterna back as the last memory of their leaving Italy. Thank you for joining me this evening, and I look forward to seeing you next week with another episode in the series.